A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, we have a classic horror in the pantry situation for you today. Daniel sent us this one, and it is visceral. He says, anyone who thinks that bulk dry goods aren't perishable has likely never seen weevils crawling around the bottom of a rice jar. He wants us to talk about these disturbing creatures and how they often emerge only after you've long forgotten you even bought that big bag of white rice.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn. I have to tell you, this is one of those topics that makes your skin crawl the more you learn about the actual biology. People treat a bag of rice like it is a piece of granite, just a shelf-stable rock that stays there forever. But it is actually a ticking biological clock.
It really is. You open the pantry to make dinner. You grab that jar of jasmine rice you bought 6 months ago, and suddenly the bottom of the glass is moving. It's like a tiny, crunchy civilization has moved in without paying rent. And by the way, before we dive into the snout of the matter, fun fact, Google Gemini 3 Flash is writing our script today.
Which is fitting, because we are going to need some high-speed processing to get through the sheer volume of eggs these things lay. We are talking about Pseudophilus oryzae, the rice weevil. And the reason they are so disturbing, Corn, isn't just that they are bugs in your food, it's that they are literally pre-installed.
Pre-installed, like a bloatware app on a new phone, but instead of a calendar you don't use, it's a beetle with a trunk. So, Daniel's point about them emerging months later, that's not just bad luck or a hole in the bag. That is the design of the system, right?
It is the ultimate Trojan horse strategy. Most pantry pests, like flower beetles or Indian meal moths, are opportunists. They find a gap in your Tupperware or a tear in a cardboard box and move in from the outside. But the rice weevil is an internal parasite of the grain. The infestation doesn't start in your kitchen, it starts in the field or the grain elevator before the rice is even bagged.
So when I'm standing in the grocery store looking at a pristine sealed plastic bag of rice, there is a non-zero chance that the passengers are already inside the individual grains, just waiting for the right moment to say hello.
Not just a non-zero chance, it's statistically probable if you buy in bulk. The female weevil has these incredibly strong mandibles at the end of that long snout. She chews a microscopic hole into a single kernel of rice, deposits an egg inside, and then seals that hole with a gelatinous secretion. It's a surgical strike. To the human eye, and even to most industrial sorting machines, that grain looks perfectly solid and healthy.
That is genuinely devious. It's a sealed bunker for the larva. And I assume once the egg is in there, the clock starts ticking. Or can they just hang out in sleep mode for a while?
That is where the diapause mechanism comes in, and this is what makes Daniel's observation about them appearing long after you've forgotten about them so accurate. These embryos can remain dormant for 6 to 12 months. They are essentially waiting for the environmental cues that tell them, hey, it's safe to eat your way out now.
And in a climate-controlled house, those cues are basically whenever we turn the heat on or during a humid summer. I'm imagining a little weevil alarm clock going off in the pantry. But why the long delay? Why not just hatch immediately and get to the feast?
Evolutionarily, it's a survival hedge. If every egg hatched at once during a dry spell or a cold snap, the whole generation could be wiped out. By staggering the hatching through diapause, the species ensures that at least some of them will hit a window of ideal temperature and moisture. For a rice weevil, the Goldilocks zone is usually around 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity. When your pantry hits those levels, the larva wakes up, eats the inside of the kernel using it as both a house and a buffet, and eventually pupates.
So the surprise isn't that they got in. The surprise is that they finally finished their interior remodeling and decided to step out onto the patio, which happens to be my rice jar.
Well, not exactly. I shouldn't say that, but that is the mechanism. When you see them crawling at the bottom of the jar, you aren't seeing the beginning of the infestation. You are seeing the climax. They have already spent weeks as larvae inside the grains, hollowed them out, turned into pupae, and finally emerged as adults. Those little holes you see in the rice kernels? Those are called shot holes. They are the exit wounds of the weevil.
Exit wounds in my risotto. Great. Thanks, Herman. That's a lovely image. But let's talk about the bulk buying aspect Daniel mentioned. We're all trying to save money, right? We go to the big box stores. We buy the 20-pound bag of rice because it's efficient. Are we just inviting a larger army into our homes by doing that?
There is a definite infestation paradox with bulk goods. On one hand, buying a massive bag and transferring it to a sealed container feels like you're being responsible. But the sheer volume of grain increases the statistical likelihood that you brought home an infested batch. Plus, bulk bins at grocery stores are notorious cross-contamination points. If one bin of organic quinoa has weevils, and the scoop gets shared or the bins aren't deep cleaned between refills, the whole row is compromised.
It's like a daycare center for bugs. One kid has a cold and suddenly the whole class is sneezing. Except instead of sneezing, it's snout beetles boring into your starch. I read somewhere that the USDA actually has acceptable levels for this stuff, which is a sentence I wish I'd never seen.
Oh, the defect action levels. Yeah, the government basically acknowledges that it is impossible to have a 100% sterile food supply when you are dealing with literal billions of tons of grain. They have thresholds for insect fragments and larvae because, at a certain scale, it's just part of the biomass. But for the home consumer, seeing a live one is a much different psychological experience than eating a microscopic fragment that's been processed into flour.
It's the movement that gets you. If it's still, it's food. If it moves, it's an intruder. But let's look at the biology a bit more. You mentioned the snout. That's the weevil. Look, right? That long trunk?
Yes, that's their rostrum. It's not just for aesthetics, it's a highly specialized tool. At the very tip are the mouth parts. They use it like an auger to drill into hard seeds. And it's worth distinguishing the rice weevil from its cousins. You have the granary weevil, which is a bit bigger and can't fly, and then you have the rice weevil, which has 4 little reddish-orange spots on its back, and this is the fun part, it can fly.
Oh, fantastic. So not only are they in my rice, but they can launch an airborne assault on the pasta in the next cabinet.
They are surprisingly mobile. If they emerge in a jar that isn't perfectly airtight, and I mean gasket sealed airtight, they will find their way out and start scouting for new territory. They can chew through paper, thin plastic, and cardboard. That box of crackers you haven't touched in 3 months? To a rice weevil, that's a luxury condo.
This is why I have trust issues with my pantry. But okay, if we're talking about the hidden biology, what happens if you accidentally eat them? Because I know people who just wash the rice and keep going. Are we talking about a safety issue or just a gross out factor?
It's almost entirely a gross out factor. Rice weevils aren't toxic. They don't carry human diseases like cockroaches or flies might because they spend their entire lives inside a clean grain of rice. In many parts of the world, they are just viewed as extra protein. Historically, sailors eating hardtack, those rock-hard biscuits, used to call them bargemen. They would tap the biscuit on the table to knock the weevils out before taking a bite. If you didn't knock them out, you just had a slightly crunchier dinner.
Bargemen. Sailors were clearly better at branding than we are. I'd much rather have bargemen in my soup than snout beetles. But the real problem isn't just the bug itself, it's what they do to the food. You mentioned moisture earlier.
Right. When a large population of weevils starts respiring and defecating, let's be honest, that's what's happening. Inside a sealed container, they change the microclimate. They increase the moisture content and the temperature of the grain. That can lead to secondary problems like mold or fungal growth. So while the bug itself won't hurt you, the environment they create can eventually spoil the food in a way that could make you sick.
So it's a cascading failure. One weevil leads to 300 eggs, which leads to a heat spike, which leads to mold, and suddenly your shelf-stable, 20-pound bag of rice is a biological hazard. It really reinforces Daniel's point that perishable is a relative term. We think of perishability as rotting, like a banana. But for grains, perishing, often means being reclaimed by the ecosystem.
That's a great way to put it. It's a reclamation project. And because we're buying these massive quantities, we're providing a massive amount of habitat. If you buy a small 1-pound bag and eat it in a week, the weevils never have time to complete their life cycle. You probably eat the eggs and the tiny larvae without ever knowing, and your body just processes it. But when that bag sits for 6 months, you're giving them the time they need to reach adulthood.
It's the first in, first out rule that people always ignore. I'm guilty of it too. You buy a new bag, you put it in front of the old bag because the old bag is heavy and you don't want to move it. 6 months later, you've basically built a weevil nursery in the back of the shelf.
And let's talk about the float test. This is a really practical way to see the hidden biology in action. If you're suspicious of an old jar of rice, you pour water in. The healthy solid grains will sink. But the grains that have been hollowed out by a weevil larva will float. It's like a tiny starchy buoyancy kit. If half your rice is floating, you're not looking at rice anymore, you're looking at empty husks and bug houses.
It's like a starchy ghost town. All the inhabitants have moved out, and you're just left with the ruins. It's fascinating how much of our food security relies on basically outrunning these life cycles. We are in a constant race against insects to see who gets to the calories first.
We really are. And the scale of this is massive. The USDA estimates that about 10 to 15% of all stored grains worldwide are lost to insect infestation every year. That is a staggering amount of food that just disappears into the maws of weevils and beetles. When you think about global food prices or supply chain issues, these little guys with the trunks are actually major geopolitical players.
I never thought I'd hear weevils and geopolitical players in the same sentence, but here we are. It makes sense, though. If you lose 10% of your harvest to bugs in the silo, that's 10% less for export, which drives up prices, which affects everything. It's a tiny bug with a massive footprint.
And the scary part is their resilience. We think we can just freeze them out or heat them up, but they have evolved to survive in some pretty harsh conditions within the grain. However, there are ways to fight back, which I think we should get into, because I don't want to leave everyone feeling like their pantry is a lost cause.
Yeah, let's move into the how do we not live in a bug circus portion of the show. Because Daniel is right, it's disturbing, but it's not inevitable. If we understand the biology, we can disrupt the cycle. What's the first line of defense?
The absolute gold standard for home prevention is the freezer method. When you bring home a new bag of rice, flour, or even birdseed, anything dried and starchy, you put it in the freezer for at least 4 to 7 days.
A whole week? That seems like a lot of real estate in the freezer for a bag of rice.
It's the only way to be sure you've killed the eggs and the dormant larvae. A quick 24-hour chill might slow them down, but these things are hardy. You need a deep, sustained freeze to rupture those egg cells. If you do that, you've essentially sterilized the bag. Even if there were eggs in there, they're dead now. They'll just be microscopic bits of protein that get washed away or cooked. They'll never hatch.
So it's a proactive strike. You're killing the bargemen before they ever get a chance to board the ship. I like that. What about the airtight myth? Because I've seen people put rice in those fancy plastic containers with the pop-top lids, and they still find bugs.
2 things happening there. First, if the eggs were already inside the rice, the airtight container isn't a wall, it's a greenhouse. It keeps the moisture and temp stable, which actually helps them hatch. Second, many airtight containers aren't actually airtight to a bug that can chew. If the seal isn't a true rubber gasket that creates a vacuum or a very tight pressure fit, a determined weevil can often find a way through. Glass jars with those wire bale lids and rubber gaskets are much better than the cheap plastic ones.
Glass is the way to go. It's a harder material for them to interact with, and you can see them. There is nothing worse than a solid-colored plastic bin where the infestation is happening in the middle, and you don't know it until you pour a cup of rice into your boiling water and see 50 black dots floating to the top.
That is the aha moment nobody wants. And speaking of boiling water, that's another tactic. If you're really worried, washing your rice thoroughly in a bowl of water before cooking, which you should be doing anyway to remove excess starch, will float most of the infested kernels. You just skim the top and you've significantly improved the purity of your meal.
It's the skim and simmer method. What about the old wives' tales Daniel mentioned? Bay leaves? Garlic? I've seen people put dried chilies in their rice bins. Does that actually do anything? Or is it just making the weevil's last meal more flavorful?
It's mostly flavor. There is some evidence that the essential oils in bay leaves act as a mild repellent, but repellent is the key word. It might discourage an adult weevil from flying into a container, but it does absolutely nothing to the larva that is already inside a grain of rice. That larva doesn't care about the smell of bay leaves, it's inside a bunker. It's not coming out until it's finished its job. So, by all means, put a bay leaf in there if you like the smell, but don't rely on it as a security system.
It's like putting a no trespassing sign on a house that already has a burglar in the basement. Not very effective. What about the 6-month rule versus the 12-month rule? Because we're talking about perishability here. How long should we actually be keeping this stuff?
If you haven't frozen the rice, I would say 6 months is your high-risk window. If you hit the 6-month mark and that rice has been sitting at room temperature, the probability of an emergence goes up exponentially. If you have frozen it and it's in a truly airtight glass jar, that rice can last years. The perishability isn't about the rice rotting, it's about the biological clock of the pests. If you stop the clock, you extend the shelf life.
That is an important distinction. The rice itself is remarkably stable if kept dry. It's the pre-installed life that ruins the party. So, if I buy a 50-pound bag of rice today, which, let's be honest, is a lot of rice for a sloth and a donkey, I should probably break it down into smaller, manageable glass jars after a week in the freezer.
That is the pro move. Divide and conquer. If you keep 50 pounds in one giant bin and it gets infested, you lose 50 pounds. If you have 10 5-pound glass jars and one of them somehow has a failure, you only lose 5 pounds. It's about compartmentalizing risk.
It's like a server rack. You don't want one bad drive to take down the whole network. I'm also thinking about the second-order effects Daniel touched on. We talked about food waste, but what about the psychological impact? I know people who, after finding weevils once, stop buying rice for a year. It changes how you interact with your kitchen.
It's a form of pantry trauma. You start looking at everything through a lens of suspicion. Is that a speck of pepper or a snout? It makes cooking stressful instead of enjoyable. And that actually leads to more waste, because people start throwing away perfectly good food just because they're paranoid. That's why I think the freezer method is so important. It gives you that psychological peace of mind. You know you've neutralized the threat.
It's the nuclear option for the freezer. I love it. But let's look at the bigger picture for a second. We're in 2026, and we're seeing more people move toward bulk buying and prepping because of economic uncertainty. If this trend continues, we're essentially creating a massive, decentralized network of weevil habitats across the country.
It's a distributed bug network. And you have to wonder if the industrial side is going to have to change their tactics. Right now, most commercial grain is fumigated with things like phosphine gas. It's effective, but pests are starting to develop resistance to it. If we can't kill them at the silo, then the burden of biosecurity falls entirely on the consumer.
Pantry biosecurity is a great term. It sounds very official. I can see the My Weird Prompts, tactical pantry apron now. But seriously, it does feel like we're losing the set it and forget it luxury of the modern supermarket. We have to be more active participants in our food storage.
We do. And that's a good thing, honestly. Understanding where your food comes from and how it can fail makes you a more resilient consumer. Daniel's prompt is a great reminder that the hidden life of our food is always there, whether we see it or not. We like to think of our homes as these sterile boxes separated from nature, but nature is always trying to get back in. Or in the case of the weevil, it's already there, just waiting for its cue.
It's a biological sleeper cell. I'm thinking about the what-if scenarios here. What if we developed a rice strain that was naturally resistant to weevil boring, like a hard-shell rice?
They're actually working on that. There is research into the physical properties of grain husks and how they can be bred to be too tough for the weevil's mandibles. But the trade-off is often that it makes the rice harder for us to process or cook. It's a delicate balance. You want it soft enough to eat but hard enough to be a fortress. So far, the weevil is winning that arms race on the tasty rice varieties.
The weevil has good taste. I can't blame them. Who doesn't love a nice basmati? But, okay, let's wrap this up with some actual takeaways for the listeners. because we spent a lot of time talking about bug snouts and exit wounds, and I want people to feel empowered when they go to the grocery store next.
First takeaway, the freezer strike. 4 to 7 days for any new dried goods. Don't skip it, it's the only way to kill the internal eggs. Second, glass over plastic. Use jars with actual gaskets. It prevents escapees from moving to other parts of the pantry and makes it easier to spot an issue early.
Third, the float test. If you're unsure, pour some in a bowl of water. If it floats, it's a ghost. Let it go. And fourth, rotation. Don't let your emergency rice become a bug nursery. Eat what you buy and rotate the old stuff to the front.
And maybe a fifth, don't panic. If you do find them, it's not a sign that your house is dirty. It's just a sign that biology happened. Wash the rice, or if it's too far gone, compost it and move on. You aren't a failure. You just lost a round to a very specialized, very ancient competitor.
A competitor with a trunk. I think I'm going to go home and put my entire pantry in the freezer now, just to be safe. Everything, even the canned goods.
Maybe not the cans, Corn. Physics still applies to freezing liquids in metal. But the rice, definitely.
Fine. No frozen beans. But the jasmine rice is going on ice. This has been a fascinating, if slightly itchy, deep dive. Thanks to Daniel for the prompt. I think a lot of people are going to be checking their jars tonight.
And thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running while we obsess over beetle mandibles.
Also a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We couldn't do these deep dives into the disturbing world of insects without them.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you learned something new about your pantry today, or if you just enjoyed the Bargeman history, leave us a review on your podcast app. It helps more people find the show and join our weird little community.
We're on Telegram too. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get notified when new episodes drop. We'll be back next time with whatever weirdness Daniel sends our way.
Keep your rice dry and your freezer cold.
Later.
See ya.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth